Hello and welcome to this microfocus security demonstration for ArcSight SmartConnectors. Today we're going to be installing and demonstrating the Microsoft Azure Monitor Event Hub Smart Connector. So firstly I want to start off by going through the configuration guide a little bit and show you some of the important pieces, some of the gotchas, some of the assumptions and so forth that you should take into consideration. And of course how it all actually hangs together and works. So just like any other Smart Connector configuration guide, there's lots of information here. We typically start off with what are the actual event sources and explaining a little bit about where and how the events are actually generated. So in the case of Azure, it's forever expanding, and there's lots of new services and so forth available to it, just like other cloud platforms on a consistent basis. But something that it does quite well is to have this sort of central repository for logs for things like resource management. So we call those our control management logs, updating and deleting disks, restarting of VMs and so forth. We've got data plane logs, so around actual usage themselves, and then processed events, such as alerts and so forth that you might configure. So there's a lot there. This is just a small snippet of it. And then we also go on to explain some of the other pieces that are important for this Smart Connector. It's important to sort of understand how each of these pieces play a part. Firstly, the resource manager, so the actual deployment of resources into Azure. We've got this thing called an app service plan, which is effectively like how you want your Smart Connector functionality to be actually deployed. And there's two options there, an app. You can do a app plan, or you can do what we call a consumption plan, and both have their pros and cons. I would suggest reading the documentation in depth to understand which is the best method for you. I'm going to use a very simple, straightforward consumption plan because it's just a small connector with just a few events. You've got this piece called Azure Functions. So this is effectively the same thing as in AWS, the Lambda function. So essentially serverless compute. And that's exactly how a connector works. We input our connector functionality into Azure Functions, and that function, or those functions, or the connector get run in the cloud in a serverless compute type model. You'll need to be familiar with storage accounts, because we actually need to go into our storage account once it's created and actually upload a new certificate file. So the monitor function within the Smart Connector can keep tabs on a successful connection to our syslog-ng Smart Connector. And then we've, last but not least, we've got this concept of an event hub. The easiest thing to think about this is think of a Kafka cluster. It's an event broker, so to speak, and this is how we're hooking in and pulling those events out in JSON format, converting them to Ceph, and then sending them down the line to either a load balancer or a syslog-ng connector. So we've included a nice little diagram here of what actually the architecture is actually doing. Let me just zoom in here and take a closer look. So effectively our monitoring around Azure, Active Directory and so forth, these events, particular types of events, audit and sign-in logs, activity logs, and even diagnostic logs if you wish. Now they can go into this event hub piece, so to speak. So effectively think of that as that Kafka cluster, and then those events are pulled out by our Azure event processes. You'll notice that this large square here is effectively our entire connector, and we have multiple sort of sub-processes running in Azure that actually pull those different types of events depending on what they are, and each of those use different map files which are used to effectively parse those JSON events. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of different JSON event types, and that's why we have a lot of map files already included by default to cover all those different categories. So it's quite comprehensive. We've also got this monitor app piece, which is effectively a heartbeat. We're making sure that we have a good connection down to our syslog-ng connector or the load balancer downstream. So just like we do with our CloudTrail and CloudWatch type connectors, we have a monitor function to make sure that things are running and we're not losing any events. So that's a quick look at the actual overall architecture. It's reasonably straightforward, but obviously there's a few gotchas and so forth you need to be aware of. I don't have an Active Directory per se available to me for today's demonstration, so I'll be actually collecting effectively sort of resource logs instead, so things like machine startup and shutdown and so forth. So but the other thing too to keep in mind, if you want to collect Active Directory sign-ins, you actually need a P1 or a P2 premium edition of Azure Active Directory. So keep that in mind. If you're just using a standard test MSDN type account or something like that with Azure, it probably won't work for you. So just be aware of that. So when we come to the actual deployment connector, there's a number of steps involved, and there's a little bit to it, and you've got to make sure that you cover off all the steps, or it will not work. So let's take a quick look at some of that stuff now. First thing you've got to do is setting up a user permission in Azure. That person needs to be, or that entity should be a new user, but what you've got to make sure is you've got to give them a directory role of a global administrator or a security admin, security reader, or a reports reader. And they need to be an owner or a contributor to the subscription itself. So that's a really important point. You have to be an owner or contributor to the subscription. If you do not, you won't have appropriate permissions to actually install the resources into Azure. You've got to open up ports. So you'll need a port obviously for your load balancer or your syslog-ng connector. I'm just using a syslog-ng connector today. So you'll need to, so by default it's port 1999. It'll be a TLS connection, just like our CloudTrail and CloudWatch connectors. But the syslog-ng connector will run at quite high speeds, so there's no need for a load balancer in my case. So remember to open that up in the Azure portal. You'll need to go to the virtual server itself, click on networking, and then open up a firewall rule to allow that to occur. You'll also need to, when you've got a Windows host ready to install or deploy this connector, you need to make sure that you are able to run the various scripts without intervention or without any restrictions. So firstly, you'll need to open up a PowerShell. You'll need to obtain the execution policy on that host at the time, and you need to set it to unrestricted. And if it's not set to unrestricted, it's recommended that you actually run this command first, and then you'll be able to run the rest of this script. You'll install some modules here. You'll install a few other bits and pieces. But then when we come down here, before we run the actual deploy function, there's a number of different things you need to do here in terms of the configuration file or App.Properties. So when you download the connector, it'll be connector 7.15, or in our case, the new 8.x version is now available to you. You'll edit this file called App.Properties. There's a whole bunch of different basically functions and so forth that you want to give unique names to. Now by default, the default name should work for you just fine. The recommendation I can make here is if you attempt a deployment and it fails for whatever reason, it's taken me a couple of goes to get it right, but if it ever actually fails, don't try and delete the resources or simply run the deployment again. If you do, you'll get more errors because it's finding resources are already existing, and it doesn't want to reuse anything. It wants to start from scratch. So if you do have a failed deployment, do an undeploy first. And then that way the PowerShell script will clean up everything in terms of Azure resources correctly by itself. You'll need to specify the connector host name or an IP address. Now, this is an interesting thing. It is the external IP address of your syslog connector ng machine. It is not the internal by default. If you want to use internal IP addresses, there's a section in the guide later on which tells you how to effectively set it up to use private addressing only. That may well be the best way to go in a production environment, but you can also lock it down very well to just allow particular IP addresses to send syslog to your connector host or to your syslog ng host. By default, when you install the Azure connector, it uses the remote management.p12 file from your syslog-ng connector for a successful TLS connection. Now, by default, it actually deploys a sort of a default certificate, and that won't be enough for it to create a connection back to your syslog-ng connector. What you've got to do is you've got to take note of this piece here where you need to actually go to your storage account and upload the correct remote management.p12 file for your syslog-ng connector, restart the functions, and then you'll see TLS connections coming in. I will show you that later on. So you'll need to do things in the App.Properties file like specifying an account name, event hub space name. The important thing to remember here is that they are 3 to 24 characters long, lowercase, has to be lowercase, and they can only be alphanumeric, and if I remember correctly, it's underscores or hyphens only. So it's quite restrictive in the name, so be careful of that. I've often tried to install it and I've accidentally put in a capital letter or something like that. The script will fail, but it will fail and tell you exactly what's gone wrong, so it's pretty good like that. The service plan, as I mentioned before, is it going to be an app service plan or a consumption plan? I just use consumption plan. It's quite straightforward, but it does have limited scalability. If this is a production environment, you would use the app service plan, which allows you to have and specify down here extra configuration around how large you want it to be from the outset. So that might be the best way to go. So what you do after that is, once you've finished editing that file, you then can run the deploy function as an administrator in PowerShell. So let me just give you a quick look at this actual App.Properties file, because there's quite a bit to it. And so you've got what we saw in the configuration guide, the resource group name. I've taken all the default values and I've added a 000 to the end of each one, just to give it a little bit more uniqueness. You'll also need to specify further down. You'll notice I've got a WAN IP address or a public IP address. That is telling my SmartConnector in Azure, where do I send my syslog? You can by default have logging level of all, so that's good. I've switched on debug mode. You don't, by default, that will be switched off. You can also specify logging to a storage account by default as well. So instead of just sending events to syslog-ng, you can actually get it to send it to a storage account as well. This is good for debugging and if you want to use it for other purposes. You'll also notice a location. I've got here Australia East. If you're looking for the names for all of the names that are possible, you'll find it down here in Activity Lob's subscription location. So this is a great big long list of all the locations there. So make sure wherever you are, it matches accordingly. Key store file name, and as well as the default password, which we all know is change it by default. It's probably a good idea to change that as well in a production environment. So that's what is required to set up App.Properties. I've deliberately gone and moved all this important stuff up to the top of the file simply so it's easier for me to see and to work with, but that's all there is to it. So now that we've got that file specified, and again, these are just random suffixes I've put on the end of my file simply so it makes it a little bit more unique. If you do go beyond 24 characters, this script will fail as well, but it will give you a reason as to why. All right, so now that we've completed that piece, we can now run this deploy function. So what we'll do now is we'll zoom in on a PowerShell script and actually show you the installation process. So now let's take a quick look at the actual installation itself. So I've run deploy function.ps1. I'm asked to authenticate using my subscription and my email address and so forth. And then basically what you'll see happening over time, and I've actually sped this part of the video up by 3 to 4 times as it takes a good 10 minutes to install. And you'll notice that the installer is giving us some nice messages about what part it's actually performing in the installation process. And it's important to keep in mind that once in a while you may see some red, an error type thing. It doesn't mean to say that it's failed, and it will continue on quite normally. and you see here that I've got an error come up. Again, nothing fatal. That'll continue to install quite happily. So we'll let this continue on, and you can fast forward this little part of the video if you like, but when we get to the end of it, it will give us a installation complete message. And now that's just about complete. And we'll return back to the command prompt. And there's one other thing that we need to do after this. If you did have errors at the end, it will tell you, but if you have an unsuccessful install, just uninstall it first. Last but not least, we need to upload the new or updated management certificate to the storage account. So that's what I'm doing here now. I'm just deleting the old one because it is a default one, so don't think that that's the correct one for the syslog ng or your load balancer. So I'll upload a better one, or the correct one. And that gets placed into the storage account, which of course the function applications have access to. But now there's that one final piece. We actually need to then restart the functions themselves to actually pick up the actual remote management certificate, and only after then will you actually see events start to flow. So here I am just hitting the restart button on those two functions, and then we just give it a couple of minutes to start flowing events. All right, last but not least, we want to take a look at the events as they're flowing into ESM. We've looked at how the different components and pieces fit together. I've shown you how to actually look at the different various log files and so forth to make sure that things are working correctly, and obviously things like registration to service providers such as Insights and so forth are also required, as well as having appropriate permissions. But once you've got that all up and running, I've sent all my events to an ESM. I've got myself an active channel here, and because I don't have access to a particular Active Directory or anything like that, my events aren't particularly chatty. There's not a whole lot here. It's sort of one of our own internal Azure accounts, so we're not going to see a whole lot of activity. So I've just left this running for a little while just to gather up some information and some events, and hopefully we see something useful. But what's important to note is you're going to get a couple of different types of events flowing in here. Now you might send your events to ESM, Logger, Recon, doesn't really matter. But what you will see right from the get-go is these ArcSight socket test events, and they have no particular value other than helping you be reassured that the connector within Azure is actually successfully sending events from the app function to your syslog ng connector. So if you see these events here, these socket test events, you know that the communication between the Azure app function and your syslog ng is correct. You can also obviously check agent.log as well. That's another way to do it. But this is a nice, easy way to make sure that this is actually running. So I've let this run for a little while because I don't particularly have anything useful coming in. And if you'll see that I've got a couple of events there. So if I just click down into a particular area of time, for example, these green events, this is typically just these socket test events. But when I take my slider over here to a more chatty time with different event priorities, I just hone in on that particular area here. We can see some really nice events going on here. You'll see that the device vendor, Microsoft device product is Azure. The attacker address here, this is actually me. I'm coming in from a machine in Germany to the West Europe region for Azure. And you can obviously click on these and go to the event details. The event details have everything you'd expect. The name obviously has the full name of the actual action that was occurring. And you'll also see things like your subscription, where it's coming from, where it's going to. This is basically me coming in from Berlin in Germany. You'll see here as well the destination host name, username, and privilege. So that's me, of course. I'm the owner of this particular subscription. I've obviously fuzzied out the subscription ID, but essentially that's going to give us information around the actual subscription and then the actual entity itself. And in this case, if you look at the pop-up here, it's a virtual machines Linux test host. So that's me basically creating a test machine. So as you can see, it's obviously working quite nicely. The events are quite well parsed and quite clean. Some of the other areas of interest you might want to take a look at is the device custom string area. We do pop in a lot of extra information in here as well. As you can see, West Europe, obviously that's the Azure location. And just scrolling through here to the end, lots and lots of information around where it's coming from, going to, and what its purpose is, and so forth. So as you can see, that event's been parsed quite nicely. So that is a quick look at the Azure Event Hub connector for ArcSight. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. And with that, bid you farewell.